Welcome to part 2. I don't know what intro that was. Welcome to part 2 of the Ral Drawn tutorial series. To begin with, on top of a black base coated miniature, in this case I've used the Strilanex. Oh god, my pronunciation. It's the Badger black undercoat paint. It goes on very smoothly. It's a very nice paint. You don't need to thin it to run it through the airbrush. It surprised me as well. I advocate thinning everything, but not in this instance. Then with a white overcoat, so white zenithal highlight directly from above, I add Cadian flesh tone across the entirety of the face, and while it's still wet, I use some Huldra blue to gently feather it into the lower mid-tones. Again, while the paint is still wet, deep red is feathered into the around the cheeks, around the nose, touch around the mouth, around the side of his head. And then should be ice yellow. Ice yellow is used for the top highlight. Again, all while the paint is wet. Rub it together. You should feel like you're rubbing mud together. The Cadian flesh tone should go on quite thin, and then the Huldra blue, the red, and the ice yellow should increase in thickness. So the Huldra blue is very thin, the red is slightly thicker again, and the ice yellow is practically straight out of the pot, relying on the moisture in the brush to do the blending for us. We'll end up with something reminiscent of that. If it looks like crap at this point, if you're trying it on your own miniature, don't worry, it's supposed to look like that right now. The aim is to get good at the end, not the beginning. We don't want it looking good at the beginning. We want it good at the end. It's not so important that the paint is wet at this point, but I'm taking advantage of the fact that I got through that quite quickly. I'm using Elendil Violet in the very darkest recesses of the head, so underneath the eyebrows, underneath the nose, along his frown lines, along his side of his face, in the mouth, and underneath the neck. This is our nadir shadows, so the darkest shadows on the miniature, and as the paint's is still drying, I'm taking advantage of it. I'm manipulating a touch of Cadian flesh tone. I'm just feathering everything together to make it look somewhat human at this stage. Again, I promise you, it should look very unusual at this point. Should almost look like Marge Simpson after the makeup shotgun. Okay, take a touch of ice yellow. I'm just reaffirming the very top highlights underneath the eyes. Now, if you wanted a more detailed breakdown, understanding of why I'm doing this, why I'm mixing in blue, magenta, like a magenta-y red, and yellow into the tones that I have, refer back to the Mongol set of tutorials, the video tutorials, and the PDF. There's detailed description and breakdown of skin tones, as well as that refer to the textures and skin tones. The front cover has a bounty hunter on it. Okay, to finish this off, because the paint is relatively dry at this point, I'm not worried about any bleed through. I'm using Thamar Black to paint in the rubber seals around his neck. At this stage, we've established the basic tones of the face. I don't want to push it much further than this. When I glue the head onto the miniature, I'll do so before adding the final highlights, the final touches. So painting in the black seal at this point, it's just more convenient. Why do I paint my head separately? That's the question that's been raised. Well, I don't want any of the armor colour affecting the skin tone itself. I could mask it, sure, but why bother when I could just leave it on the sprue and place it on later on? Okay, this is the unifying layer. This is the filter layer. A filter layer is an incredibly thin amount of paint, thin paint, spread across the surface of a miniature, and this is Rhinox hide and a pinch of deep red to give it a more red nuance. I'll add it to the surface, then I'll use a dry brush to wipe it through, and if you're quick enough, you can use your finger to rub it across the surface of the miniature. Yep, fine art for you. Who needs brushes when you have big fingers? And you can just mash on your miniature and end up with amazing results. The reason why I use my finger there is that the top of the head, top of the forehead, top of the nose, they need to be quite bright anyway. I don't exactly want the recess wash, this filter wash, to affect it that much. So by wiping it off, we are not only kind of blending it, at the same time I wipe down, we're leaving the top layers relatively bright to build the highlight on. So there is method to the madness. As this filter layer dries, I'm just reapplying pinches of Cadian Flesh tone here and there to firm up the mid-tone. Okay, hot orange is glazed around the midpoint of the face, and as you can see, I've attached it. So often, if you paint a face in isolation, you will end up with something that doesn't look quite right, because the shadows and highlights are slightly off. By gluing the head onto the miniature at this stage, any highlights that build up will be in the correct position. Cadian Flesh tone, Cadian Flesh rather, is built up on the mid-tone through the upper mid-tone and the highlight. It's at this point I want to break down the face a little bit more and locate exactly where you should place your shadows and highlights. Okay, so we have a graphic here. The white portions is where you should concentrate building the highlights along the side of the skull, top of the forehead, top of the nose, top of the cheeks. More blue tones should be washed into the recesses around the eyes, and then more of a deep red brine oxide can be washed in the filter areas, in the in-between areas. So you can see by this breakdown, it gives a much clearer indication of where we should concentrate our highlights. In order to achieve this, we increase the amount of ice yellow to Cadian Flesh ratio to build up the highlights, and we can break it up with glazes of our previous colour until we end up with something like you can see in the notebook. Something that's piqued our interest, and that's how you build the flesh tone. There's not much flesh on this, so we can move past it, but it's a very important point, because this, as you've seen from the very imaginatively entitled subheading of this video, is Faces and Bases. You get the face right, you get the base right, the rest will fall into place. It's the old adage, especially if you grew up with heavier metal style painting in the 90s, early noughties. Faces and bases, that would have been drummed into you more than Duncan's two thin coats. That was our generation's two thin coats, faces and bases. In order for this, I've given the entire base a khaki airbrush layer, so it's quite dark sandstone colour. Then I'm using a car to build up the upper mid-tones to highlights, and this gives quite a weak ghost-like impression. I want to pigment this, I want to introduce a bit of green, because we have lots of red on the miniature, we need some green on there to show it off. So I'll use Incubi Darkness. It was coming, I needed to use it somewhere, into the shadows. I stopped the airbrushing stages at this point. I'll go over to a very cheap set of brushes I picked up from Boots. Makeup brushes, soft bristled brushes, and I'll use Nakar mixed with a tiny amount of ivory just to thicken it up slightly from Vallejo. I'll dry brush this across the entirety of the miniature. As we talked about it in part 1, when we airbrush a miniature, it can look quite dull, the finish, if we left it like that. That's why we need to break it up with these kind of techniques. Unlike dry brushing now, I'm stabbing, I've loaded up the brush and I'm stabbing the surface of the miniature to impart incidental micro fractions. You simply can't get this with an airbrush. You simply can't get... Airbrushing is very good for transitions, seamless transitions, but dry brushing and traditional brushwork will give you much more satisfying surfaces, lived in worlds, seeing the dirt beneath the fingernail. Okay, let's dirty this up even more. Incubi Darkness loads up onto the tip of the brush. I'm relying on the natural moisture of the brush to enhance the shadows. So I'm building on the shadows that I've sketched out with my airbrush. Next up, Rhinox Hide is mixed with a pinch of the Incubi Darkness. That's why it looks slightly weaker. I'm overlaying the Incubi Darkness with this to build that shadow. If it looks slightly too strong at this stage, well, that's what it's supposed to look like, because we could come in with a filter layer. We need a lot more thinner in the solution now of flat earth to unite the upper mid-tones through to the lower mid-tones. And then we'll use Nakar to build up the highlight again. It's all a balancing act. We use the airbrush to sketch out the basic tones, we use the brush to add detail, to add grit, interest and texture, and then we go back to the airbrush to smooth things out, to make it look like a 5-year-old hasn't painted it. Agrax Earthshade, just to bring it more into the realms of a stone, because at the moment it's very beige at the moment. Okay, let's have a look at one of the more technical details behind Ral. To begin with, I've given this a base of Nacre plus black, and then I've just increased the amount of Nacre in there to build up this scroll work. Look, the paintbrush was used to give a streaked effect, and now we can build up the name. So in the notebook I've described how you break up this legend. That's what they call these banner filigrees, legends. You first start with the outside letters, so in this case the R and the N, and from there you can work inward. Make sure that your brush doesn't have any offending bobbles at the top. Now this attempt was not successful. I could not capture this cleanly on tape, unfortunately. Having a camera between you and the image, it doesn't make for neat calligraphy work. In order to make the process of painting slightly easier, I've used Thamar Black on a wet palette to keep the paint wetter for slightly longer. I've also included a small amount of black ink. This will allow the paint to slip off the brush even easier, and it will allow the tip of the brush to stay wetter for longer. When doing this kind of freehand work, it's not really essential that you need a small brush. You need something with a very solid tip. I know artists who love using the smaller bristled hairs for this kind of work. Personally, I've never been able to make them work correctly because I find the paint dries in the bristles too quickly. I'd rather have a longer barrel to the brush to contain more moisture, to make sure it slips off the brush slightly easier. But it's a personal preference. I would highly advise that you try and find something that works for you. But those are my tips for that kind of scroll work. Again, this is part of the freehand series, so if you did want to improve your freehand, now would be a perfect opportunity to try that exercise. Like we had an exercise in the last video, I want you to try that next. So hashtag it, Little Legend Studio. I want to see what you come up with. Okay, gems next. We've detailed how to create gems, and it will be in the PDF tutorial. Basic breakdown is that we use, in this case we're using a complementary colour of green, in this case Boreal Tree Green. Then I use a colour that's slightly next to it, rather, on the colour wheel, using blue-green from Vallejo to create an artificial highlight. I'll go on to add black in the top portion where you'd imagine the highlight would be. Again, a more technical breakdown of this will be available in the PDF. But for now we just need to add the base layer and use a bit of wet blending to create that artificial shadow and highlight. The green is naturally darker, the Boreal Tree Green, and it's being placed on a dark surface anyway, so we can rely on that for the mid-tone at this point. The blue-green introduces a new colour and gives the gem a radiance. Now when you look at the colour wheel, each colour as we perceive it has a certain luminosity. The brightest luminous colour that we naturally perceive is yellow. The darkest is navy. Now when you create your own gems, you can break it down exactly the same way. So let's take purple for example. Purple on the colour wheel. Grab out your colour wheel, look at purple. Now which colour looks brighter that's next to it? Whichever colour looks brighter, in this case it could be like a reddish pink, you can highlight it with that. To shade it, what colour looks darker, a reddish pink or navy? It's navy, so you use the navy as a shadow. This is a skill that takes It takes you a little while to train your eye to recognize these things, but that is a very basic rule of thumb. To finish off the gemstones, I use the smile technique, so a big white grin, and then 2 dollops of white to represent the eyes. So big grin and 2 dollops. And that gives an artificial shadow, artificial reflection. To really sell this effect, you can use gloss varnish, heavily applied to the top to give it a more of a sheen, a different texture to the rest of the miniature. Or my preferred method is taking realistic water from Woodland Scenics and applying it over the top. It dries slightly thick, it dries slightly bulbous, so it will give a further impression of a gem. And you can see the deep luster of the gem shining through. And that is it. Thank you so much for joining me for the tutorial. Any questions, any concerns, anything at all, please feel free to message me. And more importantly, if you try any of these techniques out, especially the exercises I've set you, make sure you share them on social media and hashtag them Little Legend Studio. Thank you so much. I'll catch you in the next vid. Bye bye.